Colonel Marcus Whitfield stood up from his chair, snatched Sergeant Emily Carter's threat report off the table, tore it clean in half in front of the entire briefing room, and dropped both pieces into the trash can beside his desk while she was still standing at attention. He told her that a 28-year-old sergeant with a hunch was not going to stop 186 soldiers from moving out at dawn. Before we go any further, please subscribe to this channel and follow this story all the way to the end, and leave a comment telling me which city you are watching from tonight, so I can see just how far this story has traveled. Emily Carter had not slept in almost 2 days, and the fluorescent light above her desk in the intelligence room at Fort Redstone hummed the same tired note it always did at 3 in the morning. She rubbed her eyes, took a sip of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier, and looked again at the transcript in front of her. The numbers did not lie. The timing intervals between the intercepted transmissions were too consistent to be random chatter. Somebody out there near Raven Ridge Pass was coordinating something, and they were coordinating it well. She had been trained to read patterns the way other people read sentences. 6 years of signals intelligence had taught her that the enemy rarely announced their intentions directly. They hid them in small details, a frequency that shifted by exactly 4 kilohertz every time it appeared, a burst of chatter that always came 7 minutes after sunset, a silence that fell in the same places, at the same times, day after day, like a held breath. "You're still here," said Specialist Daniel Ruiz, poking his head into the small analysis room. He was younger than Emily, barely 2 years into the job, but he trusted her instincts more than most people twice his rank did. "Carter, it's 3 in the morning. Go sleep." "I can't," Emily said, not looking up. "Something's wrong here, Danny." Ruiz stepped closer and leaned over her shoulder. "Wrong how?" "Look at this." She pointed to a cluster of highlighted lines on her screen. Every single transmission near the pass follows the same rhythm. Same timing, same frequency drift. That's not chaos, that's discipline. Somebody is running a coordinated operation, and they're running it right along the route Convoy Silver Horizon is supposed to take in 4 days. Ruiz's face went still. "You're talking about an ambush." "I'm talking about an ambush," Emily said quietly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The hum of the light fixture filled the silence, and somewhere down the hall, a door closed. Emily felt her pulse pick up, not from fear exactly, but from the terrible clarity of knowing something that other people did not know yet, and understanding that the knowing came with a responsibility she had not asked for. "You have to take this to Major Reynolds," Ruiz said. "I will, first thing in the morning." "Carter," his voice dropped. "Not first thing, now. If you're right, every hour matters." She looked at the clock, 3:11 in the morning. She thought about knocking on a major's door in the middle of the night with nothing but a stack of transcripts and a bad feeling in her chest. And she thought about how that would look. And for one brief, shameful second, she almost let that thought win. Then she thought about the convoy roster she had pulled up an hour earlier. The list of names, 186 of them, mothers and fathers and sons and daughters who had no idea their names were sitting on her screen next to a threat assessment. She stood up so fast her chair rolled back and hit the wall. "You're right," she said. "Let's go." Major Reynolds answered his door in an undershirt and sweatpants, his hair pressed flat on one side from his pillow, his eyes narrowed with the particular irritation of a man who has been woken at 3 in the morning by a sergeant holding a folder. "This had better be good, Carter," he said. "Sir, I believe Convoy Silver Horizon is walking into a planned ambush at Raven Ridge Pass." Reynolds blinked at her for a long moment, then rubbed his face with both hands. "Come in, coffee's on the counter. Help yourself, because I'm going to need some." He sat at his kitchen table and listened while Emily laid out the transcripts, the timing charts, the frequency analysis, all of it. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he sat back and exhaled slowly through his nose. "You've been staring at this too long," he said. "I'm not saying you're wrong to be cautious, but this reads like pattern matching to me. You want to find something, so you find something." "Sir, with respect, I didn't want to find this. I wanted a boring shift and 8 hours of sleep." A small, tired smile crossed his face despite himself. "Fair enough," he tapped the folder. "Look, I'll bring this to the morning briefing. I'll get eyes on it. But Carter, I need you to understand something. Convoy Silver Horizon has already been cleared through 3 separate assessments. Command is not going to delay a movement of that size on a hunch from signals analysis, even good signals analysis, without something harder. What would you consider hard enough? Confirmed troop movement, weapons caches, Something visual, something physical, not just radio noise. Emily nodded slowly, feeling something cold settle in her stomach. Then I'll get you that. Reynolds looked at her for a long moment, and something in his expression softened, just slightly. Carter, I believe you believe this. I do. But belief isn't proof, and proof is what's going to move this convoy off that road, if it needs moving at all. She left his quarters a little after 4 in the morning, with the sky still black outside, and her mind already racing 3 steps ahead. She did not go back to bed. She went back to the analysis room, and she stayed there until the sun came up, cross-referencing satellite passes, pulling every scrap of imagery she could access, looking for the physical confirmation that would turn her pattern into a fact nobody could argue with. By 7 in the morning, she had it. A grainy but unmistakable satellite image, timestamped 2 days earlier, showing a cluster of vehicles parked in a dry wash less than half a mile from the narrowest point of Raven Ridge Pass. Vehicles that had no business being there. Vehicles that matched nothing in the routine patrol logs for that sector. Her hands were shaking slightly as she printed the image. The morning briefing was scheduled for 0800, and Emily walked into that room with her folder held against her chest like a shield. Colonel Marcus Whitfield sat at the head of the table, a broad-shouldered man with silver hair cut close to his scalp and a reputation for running the tightest briefings on post. Beside him sat Captain Daniels, the officer responsible for Convoy Silver Horizon's route planning, a younger man whose face already carried the strain of 100 logistics problems. Major Reynolds gave Emily a small nod as she took her seat, a silent signal that he had kept his word. Colonel Reynolds began, Sergeant Carter has developed an intelligence assessment I think warrants immediate attention. Whitfield glanced at his watch. Make it quick. We have a full agenda. Emily stood, her folder open, her voice steadier than she felt. Sir, over the past 3 weeks, I've identified a consistent pattern in intercepted communications near Raven Ridge Pass. The timing and frequency behavior indicates coordinated enemy activity, not random chatter. This morning, I obtained satellite confirmation of an unidentified vehicle cluster positioned less than half a mile from the narrowest section of the pass, directly along the route scheduled for Convoy Silver Horizon. She slid the printed image across the table. Whitfield picked it up, studied it for exactly 4 seconds, and set it back down. Sergeant, do you know how many unidentified vehicle clusters get photographed in that province every week? Sir, the timing correlates directly with, I asked you a question. Emily's jaw tightened. No, sir, I don't have that number. Neither do I off the top of my head, but I can tell you it's a lot. Vehicles move. People park where they park. This is a farming region with a war running through the middle of it. He tossed the photo back toward her, though it slid off the edge of the table and Captain Daniels had to catch it before it hit the floor. You're extrapolating an ambush from a parking lot. With the signals pattern combined with the imagery, I believe the correlation is significant. You believe? Whitfield's voice carried the particular weight of a man who had already made his decision and was now simply enjoying the process of explaining why he was right. Sergeant Carter, I've read your file. 6 years in signals. Good record. But you are not a route planning officer, you are not a field intelligence officer with boots in that province, and you are asking me to consider delaying a convoy of 186 soldiers based on radio static and a photograph of some trucks. Sir, if I'm right and the convoy moves as scheduled, those soldiers will be walking directly into a kill zone. And if you're wrong, Whitfield said, leaning forward, which, statistically, given the volume of pattern-based threat assessments that don't pan out, is the more likely outcome, then we will have delayed a critical resupply mission and shaken the confidence of every soldier on that convoy for nothing. Do you understand the cost of being wrong here, Sergeant? I understand the cost of being right and not being listened to, sir. The room went very quiet. Captain Daniels shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between Whitfield and Emily. Reynolds stared down at the table, his jaw tight. Whitfield's expression hardened. That's enough. Sir, I'm not trying to be insubordinate. I'm trying to... I said that's enough, Sergeant. He picked up the report she had submitted, the full written assessment with the timing charts and the maps, flipped through the first 2 pages with visible impatience, and then, in one motion that seemed to happen almost too fast to register, tore the entire report in half down the spine and dropped both halves into the trash can beside his chair. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Convoy Silver Horizon moves as scheduled, Whitfield said, his voice final. This briefing is over. Nobody in the room moved for a moment. Captain Daniels would not meet Emily's eyes. Major Reynolds opened his mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. Emily stood there, her hands empty now, her carefully built case sitting in pieces in a trash can 6 feet away from her, and something inside her chest twisted so hard it was almost physical pain. She had known there was a chance she would be doubted. She had not expected to be humiliated in front of the entire briefing room by a man who had spent 4 seconds looking at evidence it had taken her 3 weeks to build. "Sir?" she said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Sometimes you see patterns because they are there, not because I want them to be." Whitfield did not even look up from his notes. "Dismissed, Sergeant." She walked out of that briefing room with her back straight and her chin level, and it was not until she was alone in the stairwell, 2 flights down, that she let herself lean against the concrete wall and press the heels of her hands against her eyes. "Carter." She turned. Major Reynolds had followed her down. "That could have gone better," he said quietly. "You think?" "I'm sorry I brought it to him the way you asked. I thought the satellite image would move the needle." "It should have." Emily's voice cracked slightly, and she hated that it did. "Sir, I know I'm not senior. I know I don't have the field time some of the analysts twice my age have. But I've never been wrong about a pattern like this. Not once in 6 years." "I know." "Then why won't anyone listen?" Reynolds was quiet for a long moment. "Because listening means admitting the plan might be wrong, and nobody up that chain wants to be the one who delayed a resupply convoy over a hunch that turns out to be nothing. It's easier to bet on the plan already in motion than to bet on the sergeant who might be seeing ghosts." "I'm not seeing ghosts. I know that too." He put a hand briefly on her shoulder. "For what it's worth, Carter, I believe you. But belief from a major who just got laughed out of a colonel's briefing isn't going to change anything, either." He walked away, and Emily stood alone in the stairwell for a long moment, staring at nothing, feeling the full weight of what had just happened settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. She did not go back to her quarters. She went back to the analysis room, gathered the torn halves of her report from Ruiz, who had quietly retrieved them from the trash can after the briefing without being asked, taped them back together with shaking hands, and started again from the beginning. "Carter, you can't outwork a colonel who's already made up his mind," Ruiz said, watching her spread the taped-together pages across her desk. "Then I need something he can't argue with." "Like what? You already had satellite imagery." "I need more than a parking lot of vehicles. I need movement. I need weapons. I need something so specific he can't wave it away in 4 seconds." She pulled up a new set of coordinates on her screen, cross-referencing the vehicle cluster location against terrain maps of the pass. "There's a ridge line here above the road, with sight lines down into the narrowest stretch of the pass. If I were setting up an ambush, that's exactly where I'd put observation posts." "You're not planning to go up there yourself?" Emily did not answer. "Carter," Ruiz's voice sharpened, "tell me you are not planning to go up there yourself." "I'm not planning anything yet," she said, which was not quite a lie and not quite the truth either. "I'm planning to request another satellite pass, focused specifically on that ridgeline. If there are observation posts, they'll show up in thermal." Ruiz exhaled, relieved, though something in his expression suggested he did not fully believe her. She submitted the request through Reynolds that afternoon, and he pushed it through without argument, though he warned her that satellite tasking took time and that Convoy Silver Horizon was scheduled to depart in 3 days. 3 days felt to Emily like both an eternity and no time at all. That night, she barely slept, running scenarios in her mind, turning the pieces over and over. At 2 in the morning, she gave up trying and went back to the analysis room, where she found Ruiz already there, a stack of printouts in front of him. "Couldn't sleep either," he said. "No. I pulled some of the older intercepts, going back 6 weeks instead of 3. Wanted to see if the pattern held further back." He slid a page toward her. "It does. Same rhythm, same frequency drift, going back at least 6 weeks. This isn't something that spun up recently, Carter. This has been in planning for a long time." Emily's stomach tightened as she scanned the data. This isn't a hastily thrown together ambush. This is a deliberate, patient operation. Which means whoever's running it knows exactly what they're doing. Which means Whitfield's parking lot theory is even more wrong than I thought. The satellite pass came back 36 hours later, and when Emily pulled up the thermal imagery on her screen, her breath caught in her throat. 3 distinct heat signatures, positioned exactly where she had predicted, along the ridgeline overlooking the narrowest stretch of Raven Ridge Pass. Observation posts, confirmed. "Danny," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Come look at this." Ruiz leaned over her shoulder, and she heard him inhale sharply. "That's not a coincidence." "No, it's not." She printed the new imagery immediately, added it to her rebuilt report, and requested an emergency meeting with Major Reynolds. He met her in the hallway outside his office, and she watched his face change as he studied the thermal images. "This is different," he said slowly. "Sir, I need you to take this straight to Colonel Whitfield, not the morning briefing, now." Reynolds hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Give me 20 minutes." Those 20 minutes stretched into nearly an hour, and Emily paced the hallway outside Whitfield's office the entire time, her mind cycling between hope and dread. When Reynolds finally emerged, his expression told her everything before he said a word. He looked at it, Reynolds said, and he said 3 heat signatures on a ridgeline could be goat herders, farmers, anything. He said without a visual confirmation of weapons or personnel movement, thermal signatures alone aren't actionable. Emily felt something inside her go very cold and very still. "Sir, how much more evidence does he need?" "I don't know, Carter. I genuinely don't know." Reynolds rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture of exhaustion Emily recognized because she had been making it herself for days. "He did say one thing. He said if you're so convinced, you're welcome to put it in writing as a formal dissent, on the record. But the convoy timeline isn't changing." "On the record?" "Meaning it goes in the file. Meaning if something happens, there's documentation you flagged it." He said it gently, but the words landed like a blow anyway. "Carter, I know that's not what you want to hear." "He wants a paper trail in case I'm right," Emily said quietly. "Not a delayed convoy in case I'm right." Reynolds did not argue with her, because there was nothing to argue. They both knew she had described exactly what had happened. That evening, alone in the analysis room, long after Ruiz had finally gone home to sleep, Emily sat with a blank sheet of paper in front of her, a formal dissent form Reynolds had given her, and she stared at it for a long time without writing anything. Somewhere in the barracks, soldiers who would be loading onto Convoy Silver Horizon in less than 48 hours were sleeping, unaware that a 28-year-old sergeant, 3 buildings away, was fighting a battle on their behalf that they did not even know was happening. She thought about her father, a retired staff sergeant, who had told her the day she shipped out for her first posting, that the hardest part of the job was never the enemy. It was making people in your own chain listen when it mattered most. She picked up the pen and began to write. She wrote for almost 2 hours, laying out every piece of evidence in painstaking detail. The timing patterns, the frequency analysis, the satellite imagery, the thermal signatures, the 6-week history Ruiz had uncovered. All of it, building a case so thorough that no honest reader could dismiss it in 4 seconds. When she finished, she read it over twice, signed it, and walked it to Reynolds' office herself, sliding it under his door at nearly midnight. The next morning, less than 24 hours before Convoy Silver Horizon was scheduled to depart, Emily was summoned to Colonel Whitfield's office. She walked in expecting perhaps a small crack in his certainty. What she found instead was a man visibly irritated at having his morning interrupted. "Sergeant Carter." He did not ask her to sit. "I read your dissent." "Yes, sir." "It's thorough, I'll give you that." He tapped the folder on his desk. "But thorough isn't the same as correct, and I have a resupply mission with a hard timeline. A mission command has already signed off on 3 times over. I am not going to be the officer who delays that mission on the word of a sergeant who, frankly, has shown me over the last week that she doesn't know how to accept a decision once it's made." "Sir, this isn't about accepting a decision. This is about—" "I know what you think it's about." His voice rose slightly, sharp enough that Emily felt it land like a slap. "Let me be very clear with you, Sergeant. I understand you believe you're right. I understand you believe those soldiers are in danger. But you have taken this from a professional disagreement to something that is starting to look like insubordination. And if you push this any further, up any other chain, I will initiate formal action against you. Do you understand me?" Emily stood very still. "Yes, sir, I understand. Convoy Silver Horizon departs at 0500 tomorrow. That is final." She left his office with her ears ringing, not from anything physical, but from the sheer force of being told, in no uncertain terms, that speaking the truth one more time could cost her everything she had built. She walked back to the analysis room in a kind of daze, and it was Ruiz who found her there an hour later, sitting motionless in front of a blank screen. What happened? He threatened me, Emily said quietly. Formal action if I push it further. Ruiz's face went pale. Carter, that's not okay. That's not right. Doesn't matter if it's right, it's real. She finally looked up at him, and something had shifted in her eyes, something Ruiz would later describe as the exact moment fear turned into resolve. The convoy leaves at 0500 tomorrow. Nobody is going to stop it. Nobody with the authority to stop it believes me. So what are you going to do? Emily was quiet for a long moment, staring at the map of Raven Ridge Pass still open on her screen, the 3 red markers where the thermal signatures had appeared. The narrow winding road with almost no room for a convoy to maneuver if it came under fire. I'm going to make sure I'm wrong, sir, she said finally, or I'm going to make sure somebody's there to prove I'm right before it's too late. Carter. Ruiz's voice was low, urgent. What does that mean? She did not answer him directly. She simply reached for her jacket, checked the time, and calculated, with the same cold precision she used to read enemy communications, exactly how many hours remained before Convoy Silver Horizon rolled out toward a pass that, in her professional judgment, built over 6 years and confirmed by satellite imagery her own commanding officer had refused to act on, was about to become a kill zone for 186 American soldiers. 14 hours. 14 hours in a decision that would either save every one of those soldiers or end her career, or both. She looked at Ruiz, and for the first time in days, her voice was calm. I need you to cover for me tonight, she said, and I need you to trust me one more time. Ruiz stared at Emily for a long moment, his jaw working like he wanted to argue and couldn't find the words fast enough. Carter, do you hear yourself right now? You're talking about leaving post, without orders, the night before a scheduled deployment, to go stand on a ridgeline where you already have thermal confirmation of enemy positions. I hear myself. That's not reconnaissance, that's a court-martial waiting to happen. Best case. Best case is also the only case where those soldiers make it through that pass alive. Emily pulled her jacket on and checked the small pack she kept under her desk. The one with a camera, a notebook, a compact recorder, things she had carried on training exercises 100 times and never once thought she would need for something like this. Danny, I am not asking you to come with me. I am asking you to sign me out for a supply run to the commissary annex and tell anyone who asks that I went to bed early with a migraine. And if you don't come back? The question hit harder than either of them expected. Emily paused with her hand on the strap of the pack. Then you tell Reynolds exactly where I went, and you tell him why, and you make sure that report never disappears again. Ruiz exhaled through his nose, long and slow, the sound of a man watching a decision get made that he cannot stop. 1 hour out, 1 hour back, that's the deal. If you're not on comms by 0230, I'm waking up Reynolds myself, insubordination or not. Deal. I mean it, Carter. I know you do. That's why I trust you to actually do it. She left the analysis building through the side door, the one that did not pass the duty desk, and walked to the motor pool with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had requisitioned a light utility vehicle 2 days earlier for a supposed equipment run, the kind of paperwork nobody double-checked at 11 at night, and she was grateful now for the small, boring, bureaucratic habits of an army that ran on forms nobody read closely. The gate guard, a young private she barely recognized, waved her through with barely a glance at her badge. Late one, Sergeant? Aren't they all? Emily said, and drove out into the dark before he could ask anything else. The road toward Raven Ridge Pass was not one she had driven before, not physically, though she had traced it on a screen so many times over the last 3 weeks that every turn felt familiar in a way that unsettled her. She kept her headlights low, her speed steady, her mind running through the terrain map from memory. 2 miles before the pass, she pulled the vehicle off the road behind a low outcrop, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden, total silence. This was the point of no return, and she knew it. She climbed out, shouldered the pack, and started walking. The first 20 minutes passed without incident, just the sound of her own boots and her own breathing. And Emily used the time to run through everything she knew, checking it against itself the way she had trained herself to do with signals data, looking for the crack in her own logic that would tell her she was wrong, hoping almost that she would find one. She didn't. Every piece still fit. She was perhaps 40 minutes into the climb, moving carefully along the ridgeline she had marked on her satellite imagery, when she heard voices. Not radio chatter, actual voices. Low, careful, close. Emily froze completely, dropping into a crouch behind a cluster of rock, her heart slamming so hard she was certain it could be heard 20 feet away. She held her breath and listened. Two men, maybe three, speaking in a language she recognized enough to catch fragments of, not fluent enough to translate cleanly, but fluent enough to catch the word for morning and the word for convoy in the same sentence, spoken twice. Her hands were shaking as she reached slowly into her pack for the recorder, thumbed it on, and held it as steady as she could. The voices moved past her position, close enough that she could hear the scrape of boots on rock, and did not stop. Emily counted to 60 after the sound faded before she allowed herself to breathe normally again. She had it. Actual voices, actual confirmation. Not thermal signatures that could be argued away as goat herders. Not vehicles that could be dismissed as farmers. Real men speaking about a convoy positioned exactly where she said they would be. She almost turned back right then. She had what she needed. But some instinct, the same instinct that had kept her staring at transcripts until 3 in the morning for 3 straight weeks, told her there was more, and she had come too far to leave anything on the table. She moved forward, lower now, slower, until the terrain opened just enough for her to see down into a shallow depression below the ridgeline, and what she saw there made her stomach drop straight through the ground. It was not 3 men with rifles. It was a staging area, crates stacked in neat rows, something long and tubular under camouflage netting that her training told her with a sick certainty was a mortar tube. Vehicles more than the satellite image had shown, tucked back under overhead cover that had defeated the earlier imaging pass entirely. And moving between it all, she counted quietly, methodically, at least 15 armed men, probably more out of her sightline. This was not an observation post. This was a full ambush force, dug in, patient, and waiting. Emily's hands moved almost on their own, raising the small camera, adjusting for the low light as best she could, capturing frame after frame with trembling fingers, documenting the crates, the mortar tube, the vehicles, the men, everything. Because she understood in that moment that this was the only version of the truth Whitfield would not be able to tear in half and throw in a trash can. She was so focused on the camera that she almost missed the sound behind her. A boot, scraping stone, close. She spun, dropping flat against the rock, the camera pressed to her chest, and through a gap in the terrain she saw a lone sentry, rifle slung casually, walking a slow patrol line not 15 feet from where she lay. He paused. He turned his head, slowly, scanning the darkness in her direction. Emily did not breathe. She did not blink. Every cell in her body screamed at her to run, and every year of training screamed back that running was the one thing that would get her killed in the next 10 seconds. She lay perfectly still, her cheek pressed against cold rock, watching the sentry's silhouette through narrowed eyes, counting her own heartbeat because it was the only thing she could control. 5 seconds. 10. The sentry turned away, continuing his patrol line, and disappeared back down into the depression. Emily did not move for a full minute afterward, her whole body trembling with the aftershock of adrenaline. And when she finally allowed herself to retreat, she did it in the slowest, most careful movements of her life, easing backward along the ridge, testing each foothold before trusting it with her weight. The camera and recorder held tight against her chest, like they were the only things keeping the entire mission alive. She was almost back to the point where the ridge sloped down toward her hidden vehicle when she found the second thing, the thing that changed everything. Tucking into a crevice near the base of the ridge, half hidden under a tarp weighted with stones, sat a small transmitter unit, clearly not standard issue for the kind of insurgent force she had expected to find. It was newer, cleaner, the kind of equipment that required outside supply lines, technical support, training. Emily crouched beside it, photographing it from every angle she could manage without disturbing its position, her mind racing through the implications even as her hands kept working. A force this patient, this well-equipped, this precisely informed about convoy timing down to the correct route in the correct week, was not operating on guesswork, Someone was feeding them information. The thought landed in her stomach like a stone dropped into still water, spreading outward, and for a moment she forgot even to be afraid of the sentries somewhere above her. If the enemy knew the convoy's schedule this precisely, it meant the leak wasn't happenstance. It meant somewhere, in some system she trusted, information was moving in a direction it was never supposed to move. She photographed the transmitter one last time, memorized its position relative to the ridgeline so she could describe it precisely later, and forced herself to keep moving because dawn was still hours away. But her window was not infinite, and every minute she spent up here was a minute closer to being discovered by men who would not hesitate the way Colonel Whitfield had. The walk back down the ridge felt 3 times longer than the climb up. Every shadow made her flinch. Every sound made her stop, listen, recalculate. She was perhaps 200 meters from her vehicle when she heard the crunch of gravel behind her. Close, too close, and her entire body went rigid with the certainty that she had been made. She did not turn to look. She dropped low, moved sideways into a thicket of scrub brush, and waited, her hand instinctively closing around the small utility knife clipped to her belt. Though even in the terror of the moment, some clear, cold part of her mind knew that a knife would do her no good against a rifle if this went the way her fear was telling her it might. The footsteps grew closer. Then they stopped. A radio crackled, faint, distant, a burst of static and a few words in that same unfamiliar language. And the footsteps turned, moving away back up toward the ridge she had just descended. A routine patrol, not a pursuit. Emily allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief before forcing her legs to keep moving, because relief this early in a night like this one was a luxury she could not afford. She reached her vehicle at 1:47 in the morning, according to the small clock on the dashboard, and her hands shook so badly it took her 3 tries to get the key into the ignition. She did not turn on her headlights until she was well clear of the ridge, driving faster than was strictly safe on the unlit road, her mind already 3 steps ahead, already composing the words she would use to make Reynolds understand that everything had changed. Ruiz was waiting for her at the analysis building door when she pulled in, his face pale with the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent the last 2 hours convinced he was about to have to explain to a major why his friend had disappeared in the middle of the night. "You're 20 minutes past your window," he said, his voice rough. "I was 30 seconds from calling this in." "I'm sorry, I couldn't cut it short, Danny. I found—" Her voice caught, and for the first time since she had left the ridge, the full weight of what she had seen seemed to hit her all at once. "It's not what we thought. It's bigger. It's a full staging area, mortars, at least 15 men, and there's a transmitter up there that doesn't belong to any local force I've ever seen equipment for." Ruiz stared at her. "You're saying somebody's feeding them intel?" "I'm saying I don't know how else 15 armed men end up perfectly positioned along the exact route of a convoy that wasn't finalized until 11 days ago." She pulled the camera and recorder from her pack, her hands still trembling as she set them on the desk. "I have photographs. I have their voices talking about the convoy directly. This isn't pattern matching anymore, Danny. This is proof." "Then we go to Reynolds right now." They found Major Reynolds already awake, sitting at his kitchen table in the same undershirt from 2 nights before, a mug of black coffee in front of him, looking like a man who had not slept properly in days either. He opened the door before Emily even knocked, as if some part of him had been waiting. "Carter, it's not 2 in the morning. It's 1:53, sir, and I need 5 minutes." Something in her face must have told him this was different from every previous conversation, because he stepped back from the door without argument and gestured her inside. She laid the camera on his table, pulled up the images one by one, and watched his expression change from tired skepticism to something closer to horror as the photograph scrolled past. The crates, the mortar tube under netting, the men, the transmitter. "Where did you take these?" His voice had gone very quiet. "The ridge above Raven Ridge Pass, sir. I went up there myself tonight after the meeting with Colonel Whitfield." Reynolds' head snapped up. "You did what?" "I understand the consequences, sir. I'll accept whatever comes from leaving post without authorization. But I needed something he couldn't argue away in 4 seconds, and I got it." She pressed play on the recorder, and the low murmur of voices filled the small kitchen, the word for convoy, audible even to Reynolds' untrained ear. "Sir, this is not speculation anymore. There is a fully equipped ambush force, patient, well supplied, and possibly receiving inside information about convoy scheduling, positioned to hit Silver Horizon at the narrowest point of that pass in approximately 3 hours. 3-1. Reynolds sat back heavily in his chair, running a hand down his face. Carter, do you have any idea what you've just handed me? Evidence this direct, combined with an unauthorized incursion into a hostile staging area, this is going to blow up in about 4 different directions at once. I know, sir. I don't think you do entirely, but we don't have time for me to explain it to you right now. He stood, pulling a jacket on over his undershirt, his exhaustion visibly burning off under a surge of adrenaline. We're going to Whitfield. Now, and Carter, I need you to understand, this conversation is not going to be about whether you were right. It is very likely going to become immediately about the fact that you left post without orders and walked into an active enemy staging area alone. He is going to use that against everything you're telling him because it gives him an easy reason not to have to admit he was wrong 3 separate times. Then let him use it. I don't care what happens to me, sir. I care about what happens to those soldiers at 0500. Reynolds looked at her for a long moment, something that might have been pride and might have been fear moving across his face in equal measure. All right, Sergeant, let's go wake up a colonel. The walk to Whitfield's quarters felt endless, every step counting down a clock that was rapidly running out. Reynolds knocked hard 3 times, and when Whitfield opened the door in his robe, his face already tightening with irritation, Reynolds did not wait for permission to speak. Sir, I need 5 minutes, and I need you to look at something before you say anything. Whitfield's eyes moved past Reynolds to Emily standing just behind him, and his expression hardened instantly. If this is Sergeant Carter's ambush theory again, it's not a theory anymore, sir. Reynolds held up the camera. She has photographs. She has audio. Direct confirmation on the ground less than 3 hours ago. On the ground where exactly? Emily stepped forward before Reynolds could answer for her. I went up to the ridge above Raven Ridge Pass myself, sir, after this evening's briefing. Whitfield's face went through several rapid changes, disbelief, anger, something that might have flickered as concern before it hardened back into fury. You left post, without authorization, and walked into a confirmed hostile staging area alone at night. Yes, sir. Do you have any concept of what could have happened to you out there? Do you understand what it would have meant to this command to have a sergeant captured or killed conducting an unauthorized solo incursion into enemy territory? I understand the risk I took, sir. I took it because I believed, and I still believe, that it was smaller than the risk of doing nothing while 186 soldiers drove into that pass in 3 hours. For a moment, Whitfield said nothing at all, his jaw working, his eyes moving from Emily to Reynolds and back again. Then he snatched the camera from Reynolds' hand and began scrolling through the images himself, his expression darkening with each photograph. Mortar tube, he muttered, almost to himself. Multiple vehicles. That's not what the earlier imagery showed. They had it under overhead cover, sir. The satellite pass couldn't see through it. I could because I was standing above it. Whitfield reached the photograph of the transmitter and stopped scrolling entirely, staring at it for a long, silent moment. What is this? I believe it's a communications relay unit inconsistent with local insurgent capability. Sir, combined with the precision of their positioning against a convoy route that wasn't finalized until 11 days ago, I believe there may be an intelligence leak somewhere in our own reporting chain. The kitchen, or rather Whitfield's small entryway, went completely silent. Reynolds shifted his weight, glancing between the two of them, clearly bracing for an explosion. You're telling me, Whitfield said slowly, that you believe someone inside this command is feeding convoy scheduling to hostile forces. I'm telling you the evidence points there, sir. I could be wrong about the source. I am not wrong about the ambush. Whitfield set the camera down on a small table by the door, and for the first time since Emily had met him, she watched something like genuine fear cross his face, quickly suppressed, quickly buried back under the hard mask of command. 0500, he said more to himself than to either of them. Yes, sir, 2 hours and 51 minutes from now. He was quiet for a long, agonizing moment, and Emily felt every second of that silence stretch like wire pulled to its breaking point. Finally, he turned and grabbed a phone from the small table by his door. I'm calling this up to brigade, he said. This is above my authority to simply delay on my own signature, not with a mission this size already locked into the operational schedule. I need this authenticated and escalated immediately. Sir, there isn't time for Brigade to authenticate anything. There's barely time to reroute the convoy at all if we wait for... I am aware of the time, Sergeant. His voice cracked like a whip, and Emily fell silent, though her whole body vibrated with the desperate need to argue further. I am not going to unilaterally halt a mission of this size based on photographs, however convincing, without command concurrence. That is not obstruction. That is how this army is supposed to function, whether you like the speed of it or not. He dialed, and the next several minutes passed in a blur of clipped, urgent phone conversation. Whitfield relaying the evidence, his voice tight with barely controlled tension, while Emily and Reynolds stood in the small entryway, watching the clock on the wall tick forward with a cruelty that felt almost personal. 2:22 in the morning. Whitfield hung up the phone, his face grim. Brigade wants the imagery sent up through secure channels for independent verification before they'll authorize a route change or a delay. They're citing the same concern I had, that acting on unverified pattern-based intelligence sets a precedent they're not comfortable with, especially with a resupply mission this critical to the forward operating bases already waiting on it. Sir, this isn't pattern-based anymore. I was standing 40 feet from armed. I know what you told me, Sergeant, and for what it's worth, I believe you. The admission seemed to cost him something, his jaw tight as he said it. But belief and authority to halt a mission are two different things, and right now the authority sits with people who haven't seen what I've seen, and getting them to see it, verified through the proper channels, takes time we may not have. Reynolds stepped forward. Sir, what if we rewrote the lead vehicles ourselves, buy time while Brigade verifies? The convoy commander doesn't answer to me directly for route authority. That's a brigade level call too, on a mission of this classification. Whitfield rubbed his temples, and for the first time, Emily saw not a stubborn man clinging to pride, but a man genuinely trapped inside a system too large and too slow to move at the speed the moment demanded. I'm sending the imagery up right now, flagged urgent. I'm also going to try to get a hold of the convoy commander directly, unofficial channel, give him a heads up so he can at least have his lead elements on alert. That's not the same as stopping them, sir. I know that, Sergeant. His voice was quieter now, stripped of its earlier hardness. I know exactly what it is and what it isn't. It's what I can do in the next 2 hours, and right now it's more than we had an hour ago. Emily felt something cold settle over her. The sick, helpless understanding that even now, even with photographs and recordings and everything she had risked to get them, the machinery of the system was simply too large and too slow to bend fast enough. 0500 was less than 3 hours away. Verification through proper channels could take that long by itself. Sir, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. With respect, if Brigade doesn't move fast enough, those soldiers are going to drive into that pass with nothing but a vague heads up from their commander that something might happen. That's not a warning, sir, that's a formality. Whitfield looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his eyes. You're not wrong, Sergeant. I don't have a better answer for you right now than the one I've already given. I am doing everything within my authority as fast as I am able to do it. Then with your permission, sir, I'd like to be there when the convoy commander gets that call, so if he has questions about the intelligence, I can answer them directly. It was, Reynolds would later admit, an audacious request from a sergeant who had just confessed to leaving post without authorization, and for a moment Emily thought Whitfield might refuse simply on principle. Instead, he studied her for a long beat, something shifting behind his tired eyes. You've already broken about 4 regulations tonight to get me evidence I couldn't ignore, he said finally. I suppose one more small irregularity isn't going to change how deep the paperwork on this gets. Fine, you're with me. The next hour passed in a strange, adrenaline-soaked blur. Phone calls routed through secure lines. Brigade officers half awake and skeptical on the other end. Whitfield repeating the same evidence over and over with mounting frustration as precious minutes burned away. At 3:40, word finally came back that Brigade had authenticated enough of the imagery to authorize a partial route deviation. Not a full delay, a partial deviation, shifting the convoy's approach to the pass by nearly a mile, avoiding the worst of the kill zone the mortar position had been sighted to cover. It was not everything Emily had hoped for. It was not nothing either. They won't fully delay, Whitfield said, hanging up the phone, his voice hoarse with hours of urgent talking. The resupply timeline is considered too critical to the forward bases. And honestly, Sergeant, I understand their reasoning even if I don't love it. But the route deviation is approved, and I've gotten the convoy commander directly on comms, briefed him personally on everything you found, and he's putting his lead security elements on maximum alert. Emily felt something in her chest loosen very slightly. Not relief, not yet, but the first thin thread of hope she had allowed herself in days. That's something, sir. It's something, Whitfield agreed, and for the first time he looked at her not as an insubordinate sergeant who had caused him a very long, very difficult night, but as something closer to a colleague who had, against every obstacle his own command had put in front of her, very possibly just saved a great many lives. Whether it's enough, Sergeant, we're about to find out. 4:50 in the morning, 10 minutes until Convoy Silver Horizon was scheduled to roll. Emily stood in the operations center beside Reynolds and Whitfield, watching the comms board, listening to the low chatter of radio checks as the convoy prepared to move. Her whole body strung tight with an exhaustion so deep it had circled all the way back around into a strange, humming alertness. She thought of the men she had heard on that ridge, patient, waiting, positioned exactly where they wanted to be. She thought of the mortar tube under its camouflage netting. She thought of the transmitter hidden in the rocks, and the question it had raised that nobody in this room had yet had time to properly ask. If someone inside their own chain had leaked the convoy's schedule once, there was nothing to say they wouldn't do it again, quickly, quietly updating the enemy the moment they learned the route had shifted. Sir, Emily said quietly, the thought crystallizing into words even as it formed, if the enemy has an inside source, and that source learns about the route deviation in the next few minutes, they'll adjust their position to cover it. Whitfield's head turned toward her slowly, the color draining slightly from his face as the implication settled in. How fast could they move a mortar position, Sergeant? Faster than you'd want to believe, sir, if they had any warning at all. On the comms board, a voice crackled through, calm, professional, utterly unaware of the storm of urgency surrounding it. Silver Horizon actual. This is lead element. We are moving out. Repeat, moving out, en route to primary. Whitfield's hand moved toward the radio, and Emily watched him hesitate for exactly one heartbeat too long, caught between two paths with no clean way to know, in that final terrible second, which one led to safety and which one led straight into the mouth of an ambush that had been waiting patiently for 11 days for exactly this moment. Whitfield's hand closed around the radio microphone, and for that single frozen heartbeat, Emily watched every possible outcome flash behind his eyes at once. Then he keyed the mic, his voice steady in a way that betrayed nothing of the storm underneath it. Silver Horizon. Actual, this is Redstone 6. Hold at checkpoint 2. Repeat. Hold at checkpoint 2. Do not proceed past checkpoint 2 until further instruction. Static hissed back for 2 full seconds that felt like 20. Redstone 6, this is Silver Horizon Actual. Copy hold at checkpoint 2. Be advised we are already rolling. We'll hold at next available position. Copy that, Silver Horizon. Redstone 6 out. Whitfield set the mic down and turned to Emily, his face pale under the fluorescent lights of the operations center. That buys us minutes, Sergeant, not hours. Talk to me. If there's a leak, how fast are we talking? Emily's mind was already racing through the timeline, the 6 weeks of pattern data, the discipline of the enemy's positioning, the transmitter hidden in the rocks. If they're getting real-time updates, sir, they could reposition a mortar team in under 15 minutes if the terrain allows for it. But repositioning 15 armed men in a mortar tube without being seen takes longer than that. My guess, and it is a guess, sir, is that they built in contingency positions when they built the primary one. Patient planners plan for more than one outcome. So the deviation might not save them at all. It might not, sir, which is why I don't think holding at checkpoint 2 is enough. I think we need eyes back on that ridge right now to see if anything's moving. Reynolds was already at the secondary terminal, pulling up the most recent satellite tasking queue. Last pass was 90 minutes ago. Next scheduled pass isn't for another 2 hours. That orbit's not due back over that sector until 0640. Then we don't have satellite, Whitfield said, his jaw tightening. We have a convoy holding on an open road with an unknown force somewhere within striking distance, and no eyes to tell us if that force is adjusting. The room fell into a silence that felt heavier than any silence Emily had experienced in 3 straight weeks of fighting to be believed. because now that she finally was believed, the problem had transformed into something even worse. Belief without capability, truth without the tools to act on it fast enough. Sir, Emily's voice cut through the quiet. I know that terrain. I was on that ridge 4 hours ago. If there's a contingency position, it's going to be along the secondary rise to the east. It's the only other spot with sight lines onto the corridor that doesn't require them to move more than a few hundred meters from where I saw them. You're not suggesting you go back up there. I'm suggesting somebody needs to, sir, and I'm the only person in this building who's already seen the ground. Whitfield stared at her, and Emily watched something war behind his eyes. The same instinct that had made him tear her report in half 2 days earlier, now fighting against the plain evidence sitting on the table between them. Photographs he could no longer pretend not to see. Absolutely not, he said finally. You are not going back out there alone, Sergeant. That's not heroism. That's a second unauthorized incursion, and I already have one insubordination file open on you tonight. Then send me with someone, sir. But send me, I can read that terrain faster than anyone else on this post. And every minute we spend deciding is a minute the convoy sits exposed on an open road. Reynolds stepped forward. Sir, I'll go with her. I know the regs, I know what I'm risking, but she's right. We don't have satellite, we don't have time, and we have exactly one person who's already confirmed the ground. Whitfield looked between them, the clock on the wall ticking forward with a cruelty that seemed almost personal. 4:57 now, 3 minutes since the convoy had been ordered to hold, and every second that passed was a second the enemy might be using to adjust. Take a security element, Whitfield said finally, the words coming out clipped and fast, a man making the least bad decision available to him. Not just the two of you, I want a fire team with you, and I want comms live the entire time, Reynolds. You copy me the second you see anything. The second, do you understand? Copy, sir. And Carter. Whitfield's voice dropped, and for the first time there was something almost gentle underneath the exhaustion and command weight of it. If I'm wrong to send you back up there, it's on me, not you. You've done more than enough already tonight. Nobody would blame you for staying here. Emily met his eyes steadily. With respect, sir, I blame myself. Let's move. The fire team assembled faster than Emily would have believed possible. 4 soldiers pulled from the quick reaction force barracks, still shrugging into gear as they climbed into the vehicles. None of them fully briefed on why a sergeant from Signals Intelligence was suddenly leading them toward a ridgeline at 5 in the morning, only that the order had come down from the colonel himself, and that meant nobody asked questions. Staff Sergeant Owens, a broad-shouldered man with a scar through one eyebrow, fell in beside Emily as they loaded the second vehicle. You're the one who found this? I'm the one who found this. Heard you went up there alone the first time. I did. Owens studied her for a moment, something between skepticism and respect moving across his weathered face. That's either the bravest thing I've heard this month or the dumbest. Ask me again in an hour, Emily said. And Owens actually laughed, a short, surprised bark of sound that broke some of the tension coiled in her chest. The drive back toward Raven Ridge Pass felt entirely different this time. Not the solitary, terrified crawl of a few hours earlier, but a controlled, coordinated movement. 4 armed soldiers in a radio link back to the operations center, and yet Emily's stomach twisted just as hard. Because this time there was no illusion that she might be wrong. This time she knew exactly what waited on that ridge, and she knew that somewhere below, 186 soldiers were sitting in stopped vehicles on an open road, waiting on her. They parked further back than Emily had the first time out of caution, and moved on foot the rest of the way, Owens taking point with 2 of his men, flanking wide, while the 4th stayed with Emily near the rear. Weapon up, eyes scanning constantly. Talk to me about what we're walking into, Owens said quietly as they climbed. Primary position is on the ridge directly above the narrowest stretch of the pass. Mortar tube, at least 15 men, vehicles under camouflage cover. I'm worried about a secondary position on the east rise if they got warning the convoy's route shifted. And if they didn't get warning, then we confirm the primary position is still static. We radio it back, and the convoy moves through the deviation clean. And if they did get warning? Emily did not answer right away, and Owens did not push her, because they both already knew the answer sat somewhere between very bad and catastrophic. They reached the base of the east rise at 5:18 in the morning, the sky beginning to shift from black toward the deep gray that comes just before true dawn, and Emily felt every second of that changing light like a countdown, because daylight would strip away the one advantage they still had. Owens raised a closed fist and everyone froze. He crouched, gesturing Emily forward with 2 fingers, and when she reached him, he pointed silently up the slope. Emily followed the line of his finger and felt her blood turn to ice. Movement. Multiple figures moving with the controlled, hurried urgency of men relocating equipment, not the loose, unhurried patrol pattern she had observed on the primary ridge hours earlier. This was different. This was active. They know, she breathed. Owens, they're repositioning right now. Owens keyed his radio, his voice a tight whisper. Redstone 6, this is Fire Team Lead. We have confirmed enemy repositioning activity on the East Rise. Repeat, active repositioning. This is not the primary position. This is new. Whitfield's voice crackled back immediately, tight with tension. Copy repositioning? How many personnel? What equipment? Emily counted quickly, her eyes straining in the gray half-light. I count 6, possibly 8, moving what looks like a heavier weapon, could be a second mortar, or a heavy machine gun. Hard to tell from this angle. They're covering the deviation route, Owen said grimly. Whoever tipped them off, they move fast. The radio crackled again. Reynolds' voice this time, urgent. Carter, Owens, we need eyes on exactly where that position covers. We need to know if the deviation route is still clear or if they have extended coverage. Emily pulled the small monocular from her pack, steadying her elbows against the rock. Tracing the angle of the weapon being set up against the terrain map burned into her memory. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, but from the terrible mathematics running through her mind, angles and sight lines, and the horrifying realization crystallizing second by second. Redstone 6, this is Fire Team Lead, she said into the radio Owens handed her, her voice fighting to stay level. The new position has sight lines onto the deviation route. It's not fully covered, but the last 400 meters before the corridor opens up, that stretch is exposed to this new position. If the convoy takes the deviation as planned, they walk directly under this gun. Silence on the other end, just the hiss of static, and Emily could picture exactly what was happening in that operations center. Whitfield staring at a map with no good options left on it. Say again the exposed distance? Whitfield's voice came back, tight and fast. 400 meters, sir. Maybe 450. Enough for sustained fire on anything moving through it. There is no third route, Sergeant. The terrain doesn't allow for a wide detour without adding 90 minutes and taking them through a valley system we haven't surveyed for threats at all. Owens looked at Emily, and she could see her own dawning horror reflected in his face. There was no clean path left. Only exposure in one direction or another. Sir. Emily's voice was steady now, the fear burning away into something colder and more useful. What if we take the position out before the convoy reaches that stretch? Sergeant, you have a 4-man fire team, not an assault force. I'm not talking about an assault, sir. I'm talking about disruption. If we can force them to displace, even briefly, even just enough to break their setup, that buys the convoy the window it needs to clear that 400 meters before they're able to reestablish aim. Owens was already nodding slowly, his tactical mind working the same problem from a different angle. She's not wrong. We don't need to win a firefight up here, sir. We just need to make enough noise to make them duck. Another pause, agonizing, and then Whitfield's voice, rough with the weight of a decision no commander wants to make over a radio at 5 in the morning. Fire Team Lead, you are authorized to engage if it prevents casualties to the convoy. But Owens, that is your call to make on the ground, not mine to make from here. Carter, you are there in an advisory capacity only, is that understood? Understood, sir, Emily said, though even as she said it, some part of her already knew that the line between advisory and active was about to blur in ways none of them could fully control. Silver Horizon is approaching checkpoint 2 now, Reynolds' voice cut in. Redstone 6, what's our call? Hold or proceed? Whitfield's answer came fast. Hold at checkpoint 2, absolute final position. Do not move past that marker until Fire Team Lead confirms clear. Emily felt the weight of that sentence settle onto her shoulders like a physical thing. 186 soldiers sitting exposed on an open road, waiting on the outcome of whatever happened on this ridge in the next several minutes. Owen spread his team into position with quiet, practiced hand signals, and Emily crouched low behind a jumble of rock, watching through the monocular as the enemy team finished setting the weapon, adjusting its angle with the unhurried confidence of men who did not yet know they had been seen. On my mark, Owens whispered to his team, Emily's heart hammered so hard she was certain the sound alone might give them away. She thought absurdly in that fractured half-second of her father, of the words he had said to her the day she shipped out, that the hardest part of this job was never the enemy. It was making the people who mattered listen in time. She had made them listen. Now the only thing left was whether listening had come soon enough. Mark. The world exploded into sound and motion. Owens's team opened fire in a controlled, disciplined burst, aimed not to annihilate but to disrupt, rounds cracking off the rocks near the enemy position. And Emily watched through the monocular as the men on the east rise scattered, diving for cover. The weapon they had been setting up abandoned mid-adjustment as chaos rippled through their formation. Fire team lead, position is disrupted, they're breaking, Owens barked into the radio. Redstone 6, tell that convoy to move. Now, they've got maybe 90 seconds before this position reorganizes. Copy, moving them now. Reynolds' voice, tight and urgent. And then distantly through the radio, Emily could hear him relaying the order to the convoy commander. The words move now, cutting through the static. But the enemy did not stay scattered for long. Return fire cracked back toward Owens's position, rounds sparking off rock uncomfortably close, and Emily flattened herself hard against the ground as chips of stone stung her cheek. Contact! Taking fire from the east rise, Owens shouted, and his team returned fire in disciplined bursts, buying seconds, always just seconds, while somewhere below and out of sight, 186 soldiers pushed their vehicles forward through a window of exposure that existed only because 4 people on a ridge were willing to trade their own safety for it. Emily's radio crackled. Fire team lead, this is Silver Horizon Actual. We are moving through the deviation now. Repeat, moving now. Copy, move fast, Emily said into the radio, her voice shaking despite every effort to control it. And then, because some instinct told her the enemy fire was intensifying rather than fading, she called out to Owens. They're not falling back. They're regrouping. I see it. Owens fired another burst, ducking as return fire chewed into the rock beside him. Doc, you good? I'm good, came the shouted reply from one of his men. Reyes, cover left. They're trying to flank. The firefight stretched on. Minutes that felt like hours. The crack of rifles echoing off the mountain walls. And Emily found herself doing the only thing she knew how to do under pressure. Watching, calculating, calling out enemy movement she could see through gaps in the rock that Owens' team, focused on their own fields of fire, could not. Owens, 2 moving right, flanking toward that outcrop, maybe 30 meters. Copy, Reyes, shift right, shift right. A burst of fire answered, and Emily heard a grunt of pain from one of the soldiers. Not a scream, just a sharp, controlled sound of a man absorbing something and refusing to let it stop him. Doc's hit, graze on the arm. He's still up, Owens called out, his voice tight but level, the voice of a man who had done this before and would not let panic take root. Down below, distantly, Emily heard the sound she had been praying for and dreading in equal measure. The low rumble of vehicle engines pushing hard, the convoy moving through the exposed stretch at speed. Redstone 6, this is Silver Horizon Actual. Lead elements clear of the exposed corridor. Repeat, lead elements clear. Relief flooded through Emily so fast it left her dizzy, but it lasted only a heartbeat before the radio crackled again. Reynolds' voice, sharper now, edged with something new. Fire team lead, be advised, we're picking up a second signal, unidentified transmission originating from inside the perimeter at Fort Redstone, timed almost exactly with the enemy's repositioning. Carter, your leak theory, we think you were right. We think it's live, right now. Emily's blood went cold even as rifle fire cracked around her. Sir, someone inside the wire tipped them off tonight, while the convoy was already moving? That's what it's looking like. We're working to trace it, but Carter, that means whoever this is knew you found that ridge, knew about the deviation, and had a channel fast enough to warn the enemy in real time. That's not some old leak. That's someone active, right now, tonight. The implications crashed over Emily even as she ducked another spray of rock fragments kicked up by enemy fire. Somebody inside Fort Redstone, someone with access to operational updates, someone who had likely walked past her in a hallway sometime in the last 3 days, had been feeding real-time intelligence to the very force trying to kill 186 American soldiers. Owens, she shouted over the gunfire, we need to wrap this up and get back. There's something happening back at post, something bigger than this ridge. Working on it. Owens fired another controlled burst, and the enemy return fire, which had been intensifying, suddenly began to falter, the volume dropping, the accuracy scattering. They're pulling back. I think we bloodied them enough. They don't want a sustained fight. They wanted an ambush, not a battle. Emily watched through the monocular as the remaining enemy fighters began to withdraw, dragging equipment with them, abandoning the position that had taken them, by her own estimate, weeks of patient planning to establish. It was not a total victory. Some of them would live to fight another day, somewhere else. But the convoy was clear, the corridor was crossed, and 186 soldiers who had been sitting in the crosshairs of a mortar position an hour earlier were now rolling towards safety. Fire team lead, this is Redstone 6. Whitfield's voice came through, rough with an emotion Emily had never heard from him before. Convoy Silver Horizon reports all elements clear of the pass. No casualties. Repeat, no casualties among convoy personnel. Fall back to extraction point immediately. I say again, immediately. We have a developing situation back here that needs Sergeant Carter's eyes. Owens gathered his team, checking Doc's arm quickly, a shallow graze that had bled through his sleeve but hadn't hit anything vital, and they moved back down the slope at a fast, controlled pace, weapons still up, eyes still scanning, because the fight, Emily understood now, was not actually over. It had simply moved. The ride back to Fort Redstone passed in a blur of adrenaline crash and mounting dread. Emily's mind cycling through every person she had interacted with over the past 3 weeks. Every officer, every analyst, every clerk who might have had access to the convoy's scheduling updates, searching for the shape of a traitor in faces she had trusted without ever thinking to question. They arrived back at the operations center just after 6 in the morning, the sky fully gray now, edging toward the first pale gold of true sunrise, and the atmosphere inside the building had transformed entirely from the tense, hushed urgency of a few hours earlier into something closer to a hive under attack. Officers moving fast, voices overlapping, screens filled with data streams Emily had never seen active all at once. Whitfield met her at the door, and for a moment he simply looked at her, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Exhaustion and gratitude, and something that might have been shame before he spoke. Convoy is secure, Sergeant. Every soldier accounted for. 2 minor injuries from the initial contact at the corridor, nothing life-threatening. He paused. You saved them, all of them. I want you to hear me say that clearly, because I know I did not make that easy for you these last 3 days. Emily felt something in her chest crack open. 3 days of exhaustion and fear and desperate insistence, finally finding somewhere to land. But there was no time to sit with it, because Reynolds was already waving her toward the comm station, his face tight with urgency. Carter, we traced the transmission, he said, his voice low and fast. It originated from inside this building. Not from the field, not from some outside relay. From inside Fort Redstone on a secure line that should never have had outbound capability to anywhere near that ridge. Emily's stomach dropped. Whose line, sir? Reynolds hesitated, and in that hesitation, Emily felt the entire floor of her understanding shift beneath her. It traced back to the intelligence annex, he said quietly. Carter, it traced back to a terminal 3 doors down from your own desk. The words landed on Emily like a physical blow, and for a moment she simply stood there, staring at Reynolds, her mind refusing to process what he had just said. 3 doors down, she repeated slowly. Sir, that's Halloran's terminal. I know. That's Master Sergeant Halloran's terminal, sir. He's been in signals intelligence longer than I've been alive, practically. He trained half the analysts on this post. I know that too, Carter, and I need you to understand I'm not accusing him yet. I'm telling you what the trace shows. A terminal doesn't mean a person, not automatically. Could be spoofed. Could be someone using his login without his knowledge. Could be a dozen things that aren't him sitting there typing convoy coordinates to the enemy. Reynolds' voice was fast, clipped, a man trying to hold a lid on something that threatened to boil over in every direction at once. But right now, that terminal is the only lead we have, and Whitfield wants this locked down before Halloran even walks through the door this morning. Emily felt her legs go weak beneath her, the adrenaline of the firefight on the ridge draining away and leaving behind something colder, heavier. A sick disorientation that came from discovering the ground she had been standing on for 6 years was not as solid as she believed. Master Sergeant Frank Halloran had signed her initial training evaluations. He had recommended her for advanced signals courses 2 years earlier. He had, on more than one occasion, been the only senior analyst willing to listen when her pattern recognition instincts ran ahead of what the data explicitly proved. "Sir, he can't be the one," she said. And even as the words left her mouth, she heard how weak they sounded, how much they sounded like exactly what everyone always said about a person they trusted, right up until the moment the truth proved otherwise. "I hope you're right, Carter. I genuinely do, but we don't get to hope our way through this one." Reynolds gestured toward the far end of the operations center, where Whitfield stood with two men Emily did not recognize, dressed in plain uniforms without the usual unit patches, the unmistakable bearing of counterintelligence investigators. Those two flew in from brigade the moment the transmission was flagged. "They're going to want to talk to you first, since you're the one who identified the ambush in the transmitter booth." "Me? Why me?" "Because right now, Sergeant, you are the single most credible witness this investigation has. You found the ambush nobody believed in. You found the transmitter. You're the one who told Whitfield hours ago there might be a leak before anyone else even considered it possible. That makes you either the person who cracked this case wide open, or, and I need you to hear this without taking it personally, a person of interest they'll need to rule out before they rule anyone else in." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Emily's feet. "They think I might be involved?" "I don't think that," Reynolds said quickly, firmly. "But it's their job to consider it, and if I were in their position, I'd have to consider it too. You had access to every piece of that intelligence. You went up to that ridge alone once already. On paper, Carter, you look like someone who could have built this entire case as cover for something else." "That's insane." "I know it is. I know you, and I know that's not what happened. But I need you to walk in there and answer every question they ask completely, honestly, without getting defensive, because defensive is exactly what someone with something to hide would look like, and you don't have anything to hide." Emily swallowed hard, the exhaustion of the last 3 days crashing against a fresh wave of fear that tasted entirely different from anything she had felt on that ridge. On the ridge, the danger had been simple, clean, a matter of staying low and staying quiet. This danger was murkier, the kind that could unravel a career and a reputation with nothing more than suspicion and bad timing. The two investigators introduced themselves as Agent Pruitt and Agent Coleman, and their small borrowed office at the end of the operations center felt, to Emily, uncomfortably like Whitfield's briefing room 3 days earlier. Except this time she was not the one bringing evidence. She was the evidence. "Walk us through the last 72 hours, Pruitt said, sliding a notepad across the table, though he made no move to write in it, watching her instead with the patient, unreadable expression of a man who had conducted this exact conversation 100 times before. "From the moment you first identified the pattern in the intercepts." Emily talked. She talked for nearly an hour, laying out everything: the 3 weeks of pattern analysis, the dismissed report, the torn pages in the trash can, the satellite imagery, the thermal signatures, the solo trip to the ridge, the transmitter, the second trip in with Owens's fire team, the firefight. All of it, and through it all, Pruitt and Coleman listened without interrupting, occasionally exchanging a glance that Emily could not read at all. "You went up to that ridge alone," Coleman said finally when she had finished, "against direct instruction from your commanding officer." "Yes." "Why?" "Because nobody would listen to the intelligence I already had, and I believed, correctly as it turned out, that only direct visual confirmation would move anyone to act before the convoy departed. That's a significant risk to take, Sergeant. Career-ending, potentially life-ending. Most people don't take risks like that for an abstract sense of duty." Emily felt her jaw tighten, a flash of the same anger that had carried her through Whitfield's briefing room 3 days earlier, rising up in her chest. "With respect, sir, I don't think you're asking me a real question. I think you're asking me to prove a negative, that I'm not the person feeding intelligence to the enemy. And I don't know how to prove that beyond telling you the truth and letting you check it against every piece of evidence available." Pruitt leaned back slightly, something that might have been the faint shadow of a smile crossing his face. "Fair enough, Sergeant. For what it's worth, your account matches the physical evidence, matches Owens's after-action report, matches the timestamps on your satellite tasking request going back 3 weeks. If you're the leak, you built an awfully elaborate cover story that also happened to save 186 soldiers. Is that a compliment or an accusation? Neither yet. It's an observation. Coleman closed his notepad. We're not done with you, Sergeant. This investigation is going to take time, and you'll likely need to answer more questions before it's finished. But I'll tell you honestly, you're not our primary concern right now. Then who is? The two agents exchanged another look, and this time Emily caught something in it, a decision being made about how much to share. It was Pruitt who finally spoke. The transmission originated from Master Sergeant Halloran's terminal using his credentials during a window when the duty log shows he clocked out 4 hours earlier. Emily's breath caught. So it wasn't him at his desk. We don't know that yet. Could mean someone used his terminal without his knowledge. Could mean he came back in without logging it, which happens more than it should on a post this size. Could mean he set it up to transmit on a delay before he left. We're pulling badge access records now to see if he physically re-entered the building. What does Halloran say? Master Sergeant Halloran, Coleman said carefully, has not yet reported for his shift this morning and is not currently answering his quarters phone. The words settled into the room like a stone dropped into still water, and Emily felt the implications ripple outward even as the two agents stood, gathering their notes. You're free to go for now, Sergeant, Pruitt said, but do not discuss the specifics of this investigation with anyone outside this room, including Specialist Ruiz, including Major Reynolds, including Colonel Whitfield, until we've completed our initial sweep. Is that understood? Understood. Emily walked out of that small office feeling like she had aged 5 years in the span of one conversation, and the operations center outside seemed to have transformed again in her absence. A controlled chaos now, soldiers moving with a particular urgency of people executing an emergency search protocol, radios crackling with updates she was not cleared to hear. Ruiz caught her near the coffee station, his face etched with worry. Carter, what's happening? They pulled Halloran's personnel file 20 minutes ago, and now half the building's on lockdown for a security sweep. I can't talk about it, Danny. Can't or aren't allowed to. Same thing right now. She rubbed her eyes, exhaustion pressing down on her like a physical weight. I need coffee, I need about 6 hours of sleep I'm not going to get, and I need this day to be over. You saved the convoy, Ruiz said quietly. All of them, Carter. Whatever happens with the rest of this, you did that. Feels less like a victory than I thought it would. That's because it's not over yet. He glanced around, lowering his voice further. There's already talk moving through the building. People are saying Halloran's missing. People are saying you're the one who found the leak. Carter, you need to be careful because right now you're either about to become the most celebrated sergeant on this post, or you're about to become the center of an investigation that could go sideways on you no matter how right you were. Emily did not have an answer for that because some cold, clear part of her already knew he was right. The search for Halloran expanded through the morning, and Emily found herself pulled back into another small office an hour later, this time facing Whitfield alone, the colonel looking like a man who had aged a decade in the space of one long night. Badge access confirms it, Whitfield said without preamble, sliding a printout across the desk toward her. Halloran badged back into the intelligence annex at 0147 this morning, roughly the same time you were on that ridge photographing the enemy staging area. He badged back out at 0212. 25 minutes, Sergeant. That's how long it took him to send whatever he sent. Emily stared at the timestamps, feeling something twist deep in her stomach. He knew I'd gone up there. We think so. We think he may have known about your movements for longer than that, actually. We're pulling logs on who accessed the duty roster, who knew about your supply run request, who could have connected the dots on where you were really going. Whitfield rubbed his temples. Carter, I want you to consider something, and I want you to consider it carefully before you answer. Is there anyone at all, who might have had reason to want that convoy to fail? Anyone with a grievance, a debt, anything that gives a man like Halloran, 22 years of honorable service, a reason to do something like this? Emily thought back over every interaction she'd had with Halloran over the past 6 years, searching for some crack in the memory, some sign she had missed. He had always seemed steady, reliable, the kind of senior NCO who complained about paperwork and joked about retirement, but never gave any indication of something darker underneath. I don't know, sir. I genuinely don't know. Neither do we yet, but we will. Whitfield's phone buzzed on the desk and he glanced at it. his expression shifting instantly from exhausted to alert. He answered, listened for perhaps 10 seconds, and stood so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. They found his vehicle, off post near the eastern perimeter road, empty. For a moment, Emily and Whitfield simply stared at each other, the implications hanging heavy in the air between them. He ran, Emily said quietly. Or he was taken, Whitfield replied, though his tone made clear he did not believe that possibility any more than she did. Either way, we need to move. Carter, I need you in the analysis room right now. If anyone can retrace his digital footprint fast enough to tell us where he might be headed, it's you. The next several hours blurred together into a single continuous stretch of frantic, focused work. Emily sat at her own terminal, Ruiz beside her despite the investigators' earlier warning. Both of them now formally read into the operation under Whitfield's direct authorization, cross-referencing every scrap of data they could pull, Halloran's communication logs, his financial records that brigade had rushed through an emergency subpoena, his personal vehicle's last known GPS ping before it went dark. Here, Ruiz said suddenly, pulling up a financial report on his screen. Carter, look at this. Wire transfers going back 8 months, small amounts at first, then bigger. All routed through an account in a name that doesn't match anything in his file. Emily leaned over, scanning the numbers, her stomach sinking further with each line. That's not a man who suddenly turned traitor last night. That's 8 months of a slow bleed. Debt, Ruiz said, pulling up another document. His daughter, Carter, medical bills, look at this. An out-of-network specialist for a kid with a condition insurance wouldn't fully cover. He was drowning. Emily sat back in her chair, the anger she had been carrying since learning of the leak, suddenly complicated by something she had not expected to feel, a flicker of something painfully close to sympathy. That doesn't excuse what he did. No, Ruiz agreed quietly. It doesn't excuse 186 soldiers almost dying in an ambush, but it explains how a 22-year veteran ends up on the wrong side of something like this. Desperation makes people do things they'd never believed themselves capable of. They passed everything they found to Pruitt and Coleman, who absorbed it with the same unreadable calm they had shown in the interview room. And by early afternoon, word came back through Whitfield that a joint team had traced Halloran's vehicle's last cell ping to a small town nearly 60 miles from post, and that local authorities working alongside military police had moved in. Emily was in the analysis room, running on coffee and adrenaline and roughly 40 minutes of sleep in the last 36 hours, when Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his face unreadable. They found him, he said simply. Emily stood so fast her chair rolled back and hit the wall, an echo of the exact motion 3 nights earlier, when Ruiz had first pushed her to go straight to Reynolds. Is he alive? In custody? He didn't resist. Whitfield stepped into the room, his voice heavy. He's talking, Carter. Talking a lot, actually, like a man who's been carrying something too heavy for too long and is almost relieved to finally set it down. What did he say? Confirmed everything the financial records suggested. Said he was approached 8 months ago by an intermediary he believed at first was simply offering paid consulting work, analyzing regional communication patterns. Work that sounded, on the surface, almost identical to his actual job. Said it took him weeks to realize who he was actually working for, and by then he was already in too deep, already dependent on the money for his daughter's care, already terrified of what would happen if he tried to walk away. Emily felt the anger and sympathy war inside her chest, neither one winning cleanly. And last night, said he'd been feeding low-level scheduling information for months, nothing that had caused casualties, or so he told himself. Small things, patrol, timing, minor movements. But when the convoy scheduling came through revised 11 days ago, his handler pushed hard for details, more than he'd ever given before. He says he hesitated, says he almost didn't send it. Whitfield's jaw tightened. But he did send it anyway, Carter. And when you went up that ridge, and word came back to him that you'd found the ambush position and that a route deviation had been approved, his handler contacted him directly, demanding an immediate update. That's the transmission we traced. That's what nearly got your fire team killed on that east rise. The room was silent for a long moment, the weight of the last 3 days settling over Emily like something physical, a pressure she could feel in her chest, her shoulders, the backs of her eyes. He knew, she said quietly. He knew what he was doing when he sent that last transmission. He knew soldiers could die because of it. He says he told himself it was already too late to stop what he'd started, that once he was in, there was no clean way out that didn't end his career, his freedom, everything. Whitfield shook his head slowly. I don't offer that as an excuse, Sergeant. I offer it because I think it matters, for you especially, to understand that the person who nearly cost 186 lives wasn't a monster in some simple, easy-to-hate sense. He was a man who made one bad choice under pressure and then couldn't find his way back out of the hole he dug for himself. That's not less dangerous. It might be more dangerous, honestly, because it means it could happen again with someone else under the right kind of pressure. Emily thought of the men on the ridge, the sentry who had walked within 15 feet of her hiding place, the crack of gunfire on the east rise, Doc's arm bleeding through his sleeve, and she found she could not summon the forgiveness Whitfield seemed to be gently gesturing toward. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. What happens to him now, sir? Court-martial on multiple counts, including several that carry very serious penalties given the direct link to attempted harm against American forces. That's above my authority to determine the outcome of. That goes to a much higher level than this post. Whitfield paused, studying her carefully. What I can tell you, Carter, is that the investigation is going to want a full account from you, again, formally, on the record, because your testimony is going to be central to establishing the timeline that ties his transmissions directly to the ambush. I'll give whatever testimony they need, sir. I know you will. He hesitated, and something in his posture shifted, the exhausted authority of command giving way to something more personal. Carter, there's something else we need to discuss, and I'd rather do it now than let it hang over you any longer than it already has. Emily braced herself, some part of her certain that after everything, this was the moment the consequences finally arrived. The insubordination, the unauthorized incursion, the direct disobedience of orders not once but repeatedly over 3 days. My conduct, sir. Your conduct, Whitfield confirmed. You left post without authorization. You entered a confirmed hostile area alone against direct instruction. You challenged a superior officer's decision repeatedly in front of witnesses in a manner that, on paper, reads as textbook insubordination. He let that sit for a moment, and then Emily felt her stomach clench, waiting for the rest. I've spent the last several hours drafting the report that goes up my chain about everything that happened over these last 3 days, and I want you to understand something before you hear what I've written, because I think you've spent 3 days assuming the worst about how this ends for you, and I don't think that assumption is fair to either of us. Sir, I wrote the truth, Carter, all of it, that you identified a threat through diligent, patient intelligence work that no one else on this post caught, that you were dismissed not once but 3 times by me, personally, despite presenting increasingly compelling evidence each time, that when the system failed to act on evidence it should have acted on, you took a personal risk that no regulation anywhere requires or condones, and that risk directly prevented what would have been, by every estimate the tactical staff has run since this morning, a catastrophic loss of life. He exhaled slowly. I also wrote that I bear responsibility for the delay in acting on your intelligence, that my own initial dismissal of your findings, based on rank and experience rather than the actual substance of the evidence you presented, cost this command critical hours it could not afford to lose. Emily stared at him, unable to fully process what she was hearing. Sir, you don't have to. I do, actually, because it's the truth, and because if I let you carry the full weight of a technical insubordination charge while I quietly avoid mentioning my own failures in this, that's not leadership, Sergeant. That's cowardice wearing a colonel's insignia. He managed a tired, genuine smile, the first Emily had seen from him in 3 days. I'm not saying there won't be consequences of some kind for the regulations you broke. There likely will be some formal note in your file at minimum, but I've recommended, in the strongest terms available to me, that any administrative action be weighed against the outcome, and I intend to personally advocate that this office recognizes what you did rather than punishes it. Something in Emily's chest, wound tight for 3 straight days, finally began to loosen. Not all at once, but enough that she felt, for the first time since Whitfield had torn her report in half, something like the possibility of breathing normally again. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet. Brigade still has to weigh in, and there's a decent chance this whole story gets bigger before it gets smaller. especially once word about Halloran's arrest and the ambush spreads through the chain. He studied her for a long moment. Sergeant Carter, I owe you an apology, and I intend to give you one properly, not buried inside a report, but directly man to soldier. I dismissed you because it was easier than admitting a junior analyst might see something I couldn't. That was wrong of me, and it very nearly cost this command everything. I won't make that mistake again. Emily did not trust her voice enough to answer right away, so she simply nodded, and Whitfield, seeming to understand, gave her shoulder a brief, firm pat before turning to leave, pausing once more at the door. Get some sleep, Sergeant. That's an order I actually expect you to follow this time. She did not sleep, not immediately, because the operations center remained a hive of activity for hours afterward. Formal statements to give, timelines to verify. Owens's fire team debriefed separately, and their account cross-referenced against her own. Every detail checked and rechecked with the meticulous, exhausting thoroughness of an investigation that understood exactly how close disaster had come to a very different outcome. It was nearly 10 at night, almost 24 hours since she had first climbed that ridge alone in the dark, when Emily finally walked back to her quarters, her legs unsteady with exhaustion, her mind still turning over every piece of the last 3 days like stones she could not stop examining. Ruiz caught up with her in the hallway, matching her slow pace. Word's already spreading, Carter. Whole post knows something happened out there, even if the details are still classified. People are saying you saved the convoy. People are saying you caught a People exaggerate. Do they, though? Ruiz gave her a small, tired smile. Carter, 3 days ago, a colonel threw your report in a trash can in front of a room full of officers. Tonight, that same colonel is walking the halls telling anyone who'll listen that you're the reason 186 soldiers are alive. Emily stopped walking, leaning against the wall for a moment, the weight of everything finally, fully catching up to her all at once, and to her own surprise, she felt tears rise, hot and unexpected, not from sadness, but from something closer to the release of 3 days' worth of fear finally allowed to leave her body. I almost didn't go back to Reynolds that first night, she admitted quietly. I almost let it go until morning. But you didn't. No, I didn't. That's the whole story, isn't it? Ruiz said gently. Not that you were smart enough to see the pattern. Plenty of analysts could probably read that data given enough time. It's that you refused to let it go even when everyone with more rank than you told you to. Emily wiped her eyes, embarrassed and too exhausted to fully hide it. I keep thinking about Halloran, about how close I came to hating him completely, and how I still can't quite make myself do it fully, even after everything. That's because you understand something most people don't, Ruiz said, that the line between doing the right thing under pressure and doing the wrong thing under pressure is thinner than anybody wants to admit. You walk that line one way 3 nights in a row, he walked it the other way, for 8 months. Same pressure, different choices. Emily looked at him for a long moment, something in his words settling into place. A truth she suspected would follow her long after this particular chapter of her career had closed. I need sleep, Danny. You need about 3 days of it. Go, I'll cover the desk. She walked the rest of the way to her quarters alone, and it was not until she finally lay down, fully clothed, too exhausted to do anything more than kick off her boots, that the full magnitude of everything settled over her at once. The fear, the vindication, the strange, complicated grief for a man she had once respected and now would testify against. The bone-deep relief of knowing that somewhere out there, 186 soldiers were sleeping safely tonight because she had refused, 3 separate times, to accept the word no when everything inside her insisted she was right. Sleep took her almost instantly, deep and dreamless, and it would be nearly 14 hours before anyone at Fort Redstone saw Sergeant Emily Carter again. Though by the time she woke, the story of what she had done on that ridge and what it had cost to finally be believed had already begun spreading through every barracks and briefing room on post, growing as these stories always do, into something even larger than the truth. Though in this particular case, Emily would later reflect, the truth had needed very little help to already be extraordinary. Emily woke to the sound of her door being knocked on, firm and insistent, and for one disoriented moment she had no idea whether it was still the same endless night or an entirely new day. She checked the clock. Almost noon. She had slept nearly 14 hours straight, and her body still felt like it belonged to someone else. Carter, it's Ruiz. You decent? Barely, she called back, dragging herself upright, her muscles aching in places she didn't know could ache from lying still on a ridge for 2 hours. She opened the door to find him holding 2 cups of coffee and wearing an expression she couldn't quite read, somewhere between excitement and warning. "You need to hear this sitting down," he said. "I just woke up. Sitting down basically counts." Halloran's handler wasn't working alone. Ruiz stepped inside without being invited, closing the door behind him, his voice dropping even though they were alone. Counterintelligence pulled his financial records overnight, cross-referenced them against 2 other names on posts they'd already been quietly watching for unrelated reasons. "Carter, there's a second person. Maybe a third. Nobody's confirmed arrest yet, but the network's bigger than one desperate master sergeant with medical bills." Emily felt the coffee cup nearly slip from her hand. Bigger? How much bigger? "They don't know yet. That's the part that's got everyone rattled. Whitfield's had brigade counterintelligence crawling through this post since 6 this morning, pulling access logs going back a year. And Carter, some of what they're finding doesn't line up clean. There were at least 2 other incidents over the past 8 months that got written off as coincidence, minor patrol contacts that in hindsight look a lot less random." Emily sat down slowly on the edge of her bunk, the weight of it pressing into her chest. "So this wasn't just about Silver Horizon." "No, I don't think it was ever just about Silver Horizon. I think Silver Horizon was just the first time somebody stubborn enough to keep pushing actually caught them at it." The words settled into her like stones, dropped one by one into still water, each ripple widening the scope of what she had uncovered. And for a moment, Emily felt something close to vertigo, the sense that the ground she had fought so hard to stand on kept shifting further beneath her with every new revelation. She was summoned back to the operations center by early afternoon, and this time the atmosphere inside felt different from the frantic chaos of the previous morning, quieter, more controlled. The particular hush of people who understood they were now moving carefully through something with implications well beyond one convoy and one compromised sergeant. Whitfield met her near the entrance, his face drawn with the strain of having barely slept in 2 days. "You heard. Ruiz told me. Sir, how far does this go?" "Further than any of us want it to, and not far enough or for us to be certain we found the edges of it yet." He guided her toward a private room, lower voice now. "Pruitt and Coleman want you back in for another round today, and I want to prepare you because this session is going to be harder than yesterday's. They're not just building a case against Halloran anymore. They're trying to map an entire network, and every detail from your original intelligence work going back 3 weeks might now be relevant to threats we didn't even know existed at the time." Emily absorbed that, feeling the weight of responsibility deepen rather than lift, the way she had hoped it would after the convoy came through safely. "So this isn't over." "No, Sergeant, I'm sorry to say it isn't, but I need you to hear something else too, something that might make the next part easier to carry." He paused at the door, turning to face her fully. "Every piece of what you found, the ridge, the transmitter, the pattern analysis, it's the thread that's unraveling the rest of this. Whatever else gets uncovered in the coming weeks, it traces back to you refusing to let go of something everyone told you to drop. That matters, Carter. That matters more than I think you're letting yourself believe right now." The interview with Pruitt and Coleman that afternoon ran nearly 3 hours, meticulous and exhausting. Questions circling back on themselves from different angles, testing her account against details she hadn't even realized she'd noticed. And by the time it ended, Emily felt wrung out in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. "One more thing, Sergeant," Pruitt said as she rose to leave. "Halloran asked to speak with you." Emily froze halfway to the door. "Me specifically?" "You specifically. He's cooperating fully, has been since the moment they picked him up, and this morning he made the request through his defense counsel. You're under no obligation, and honestly, most people in your position would decline without a second thought." Pruitt studied her carefully. "But I've learned it's worth asking rather than assuming what someone wants to do with an opportunity like that." Emily sat back down slowly, her mind racing through every version of that conversation she could imagine, none of them comfortable. What does he want to say? "We don't know. Defense counsel wasn't specific, only that he wants to speak with you before the formal proceedings begin, and that he understands if you refuse." She thought about it for a long moment. The anger she still carried toward him warring with something else, some need for understanding that she couldn't quite name, even to herself. "I'll see him. The meeting took place 2 days later in a small, secure room with an armed escort standing just outside the door, and when Halloran was brought in, cuffed at the wrists, Emily was startled by how much smaller he looked than she remembered. The confident, steady master sergeant who had signed her training evaluations reduced to someone hollow-eyed and unshaven, a man carrying the full weight of what he had done. "Sergeant Carter," his voice was rough, uncertain. "Thank you for coming." "I almost didn't. I wouldn't have blamed you if you hadn't." He shifted in his seat, his cuffed hands resting awkwardly on the table between them. "I wanted to say something to you directly, not through a lawyer, not through a report. You deserve that much, at least." "Go ahead." He was quiet for a moment, gathering himself. "I trained you 6 years ago when you first came through signals. Do you remember that?" "I remember." "I told you back then that the hardest part of this job wasn't reading the data. It was trusting yourself enough to act on what the data told you, even when everyone around you doubted it." His voice cracked slightly. "I meant that, Carter. I believed that with everything in me. And then I spent 8 months betraying every single word of it, telling myself each time that it was the last time, that I'd find another way out before it cost anyone anything real. It nearly cost 186 people everything. I know." His eyes were wet now, and he made no effort to hide it. "I know exactly what it nearly cost, and I will carry that for the rest of whatever life I have left, whether that's inside a prison cell or not. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I don't think I've earned that, and I don't expect I ever will." Emily sat with that for a long moment, feeling the anger she'd carried settle into something quieter, sadder, but no less firm. "Then why did you want to see me?" "Because when the file came across my desk that afternoon before any of this, and I saw your name on that intelligence report, the one Whitfield tore up, I remember thinking, she's right. I looked at your data and I knew you were right, and I said nothing because saying something would have meant drawing attention to patterns that might eventually lead back to me." His voice dropped and almost to a whisper. "You almost died on that ridge because I stayed silent when I could have backed you up. That's the part I can't outrun, Carter. Not the money, not my daughter's bills, not any of the reasons I told myself mattered. I saw the truth in your work, and I chose silence anyway, and it almost got you and everyone in that convoy killed." Emily felt something shift inside her chest, not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding, the recognition that betrayal rarely arrived as a single dramatic choice, and more often crept in through 100 small silences that compounded until there was no way back. "I don't know what to do with what you just told me," she said honestly. "You don't have to do anything with it. I just needed you to hear it from me, not from a file, not from a courtroom." He looked down at his cuffed hands. "For whatever it's worth, Sergeant, the Army is better for having you in it, and it very nearly wasn't, because of me. I'm sorry." She left that room without another word, because there was nothing left to say that would change anything. And she walked back through the halls of Fort Redstone, feeling lighter in some ways and heavier in others. The strange, complicated weight of having confronted the person responsible for the worst 3 days of her life, and finding underneath the anger something achingly human. The weeks that followed moved fast, faster than Emily could fully process. Halloran's court-martial proceedings began within the month, and Emily testified twice, laying out the timeline with the same methodical precision she'd once used to convince a room full of officers who refused to listen. The network Ruiz had warned her about turned out to include one additional individual, a civilian contractor with access to logistics scheduling, and by the time counterintelligence closed their investigation, they had traced disrupted intelligence flow going back nearly a year, connected to at least 4 incidents that, in hindsight, had never been the coincidences everyone assumed at the time. Emily sat in the back of the courtroom on the final day of Halloran's proceedings, watching as the sentence was read, and she felt none of the satisfaction she might have expected 3 days into that terrible week. Only a quiet, heavy sense of closure, the kind that comes not from victory, but from truth finally being allowed to stand in the open where it belonged. It was nearly 2 months after Convoy Silver Horizon rolled safely through Raven Ridge Pass that Emily was called into Colonel Whitfield's office for what she assumed would be another round of paperwork related to the ongoing investigation. Instead, she found Major Reynolds already seated, along with someone she didn't recognize, a brigadier general whose insignia she'd only ever seen in photographs. Sergeant Carter, reporting as ordered, sir. She snapped to attention, uncertain what she'd walked into. At ease, Sergeant, the general said, his voice warm in a way that immediately eased some of the tension in her shoulders. General Marcus Holloway, 3rd Brigade. I've been reading your file for the better part of a week, and I have to say, it's one of the more remarkable things I've come across in 26 years of service. Emily glanced toward Whitfield, uncertain, and he gave her the smallest nod of encouragement. Sir, I was just doing my job. Your job, Sergeant, was signals analysis. What you actually did was override an entire chain of skepticism, risk your own life not once but twice, and single-handedly prevent what our tactical assessment team now estimates would have been the single largest American casualty event in this theater in the past 6 years. Holloway slid a folder across the desk toward her. That is not just doing your job. That is something this Army needs a great deal more of, and frankly, doesn't reward nearly often enough. Emily opened the folder slowly, her hands unsteady, and found inside a formal recommendation for the Soldier's Medal, the citation already drafted, laying out in careful official language everything she had done over those 3 impossible days. Sir, I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now. The formal ceremony will take some weeks to organize properly. This isn't the kind of thing we rush. Holloway's expression grew more serious. But I want you to understand something else, Sergeant. Something I think matters just as much as the medal itself. Colonel Whitfield has submitted, alongside his recommendation for your commendation, a formal request that this command review its intelligence escalation protocols, specifically the threshold requirements that allowed your original threat assessment to be dismissed 3 separate times despite mounting evidence. Emily looked at Whitfield, genuinely surprised. Sir, you did that? I did, Whitfield said quietly. Because what happened to you shouldn't happen to the next analyst who sees something everyone else is too comfortable to believe. I nearly cost this command everything because I let rank and habit override evidence 3 separate times. And if there's one thing I can do to make sure that mistake doesn't happen again after I've moved on from this post, it's making sure the system itself changes, not just my own judgment in this one case. Holloway nodded approvingly. The new protocol Colonel Whitfield has proposed requires any threat assessment supported by independently verifiable evidence, satellite, thermal, direct observation, to trigger an automatic secondary review at brigade level within 24 hours, regardless of the originating analyst rank or seniority. It's already moving through approval channels across the division. Emily sat with that for a long moment, feeling something settle inside her chest that felt different from relief, something closer to purpose. Sir, that means the next sergeant who sees a pattern everyone else dismisses won't have to go up on a ridge alone in the dark to be believed. That's precisely the point, Holloway said, and it exists because you refused to accept no for an answer when everyone above you told you that no was the final word. The ceremony took place 6 weeks later, on a clear morning with the entire post assembled in formation, and Emily stood at attention in her dress uniform while General Holloway read the citation aloud, her heart pounding with an intensity that rivaled anything she'd felt on that ridge. When he pinned the medal to her chest, she caught sight of Ruiz in the crowd, grinning so wide it looked like it might hurt. And beside him, Owens and the rest of the fire team, standing at attention with quiet pride on their faces. Men who had trusted a signal sergeant's read of the terrain when it mattered most and had come through it together. After the formation dismissed, soldiers she barely knew came up to shake her hand, young privates and seasoned NCOs alike, and Emily found herself overwhelmed not by the attention itself, but by the sheer number of people who told her, in one form or another, the same thing. I've got a read on something my platoon leader keeps waving off, one young specialist admitted quietly, pulling her aside near the edge of the formation. I keep telling myself I'm probably wrong. After hearing what you did, I don't know, maybe I'm not wrong. Maybe I just need to push harder. What kind of pattern? Emily asked, and found herself listening with the same careful attention she'd once wished someone had given her 3 months earlier. Word of what had happened at Raven Ridge Pass spread well beyond Fort Redstone in the months that followed. Not through official channels, but the way these things always traveled through military circles. Soldier to soldier, post to post, the story growing a little larger and a little more dramatic with each retelling. Though Emily would later admit that even the exaggerated versions rarely captured the sheer terror of those 3 days as vividly as the truth already had. It was nearly 4 months after the ambush when Whitfield asked Emily to speak at a joint training session for new intelligence analysts arriving at Fort Redstone, young soldiers barely out of their initial training, sitting in the same briefing room where Emily had once stood alone with a torn report in a room full of officers who refused to look at her evidence. She stood at the front of that room looking out at nearly 40 faces, most of them younger than she'd been when she first arrived at this post. And for a moment, the old fear rose in her chest. Not fear of the enemy this time, but the old familiar fear of not being believed, of standing in front of people with more rank and more experience and wondering if her words would land or simply bounce off the same wall of doubt she'd faced before. Then she remembered that this time, nobody in that room doubted her at all. 6 months ago, she began, I stood in a briefing room very much like this one, and I told a room full of senior officers that I believed a convoy of 186 soldiers was about to be ambushed. I had spent 3 weeks building that case out of nothing but timing patterns and frequency drift in intercepted communications. The kind of pattern recognition most of you are being trained to develop right now in this course, this week. She paused, scanning the room, watching young faces lean forward slightly, hungry for the story they'd all clearly heard fragments of already. I was laughed at. My report was torn in half and thrown in a trash can in front of everyone by a colonel who had exactly 4 seconds worth of patience for evidence it had taken me 3 weeks to build. A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the room, some faces shocked, others nodding as if they'd expected exactly that kind of resistance somewhere along their own careers. I want to be very clear with all of you about something, because I think it's the single most important thing I can tell you today. Being right is not enough. Having good data is not enough. You will at some point in your career see something true that the people around you refuse to believe. And when that happens, you are going to have a choice to make. The same choice I had to make with 14 hours on the clock and no good options left. What choice, Sergeant? A young soldier near the front asked, his voice tentative. The choice between protecting your own comfort, your own career, your own standing, or protecting the truth even when protecting it costs you everything you've built. Emily let that sentence sit in the room for a moment. I went up onto a hostile ridge alone in the dark, without authorization because I had run out of every other option to make people believe what I already knew. I am not telling you that story because I want you to think that's the answer every time you're doubted. Most of the time, the right answer is patience, persistence, building a stronger case, going up the chain properly and repeatedly until someone listens. What I did was, by every regulation in this Army's book, a last resort born of desperation, not a strategy I'd recommend to any of you as a first move. She saw Whitfield standing near the back of the room, arms crossed, listening intently, and she held his gaze for a moment before continuing. But I want you to understand something else too. The system that dismissed me 3 times before I finally found evidence nobody could argue away, that system has changed because of what happened. Colonel Whitfield, standing right there, is the reason the threat assessments backed by independently verifiable evidence now get automatic secondary review at brigade level within 24 hours, regardless of who submits them or how junior they are. That protocol exists because a colonel was humble enough, after nearly costing 186 lives, to admit that rank and seniority are not substitutes for actually looking at the evidence in front of you. A young specialist in the second row raised her hand hesitantly. Sergeant Carter, were you scared? Up on that ridge, I mean, when you realized how close you were to the enemy positions. Emily considered the question honestly, remembering the sentry's silhouette 15 feet from her hiding place, the sound of his boots on stone, the held breath that had felt like it might never release. I have never been more afraid in my entire life, she said simply. Fear didn't go away just because I believed I was doing the right thing. It never does. Courage isn't the absence of fear. Whatever the movies tell you, courage is being terrified and doing the necessary thing anyway, because the alternative, staying quiet, staying safe, letting 186 soldiers drive into a kill zone because speaking up again felt too exhausting, that alternative was unbearable to me in a way that outweighed the fear. The room was quiet for a long moment, the weight of her words settling over young soldiers who had, until that morning, mostly known this story as rumor and hallway legend. Hearing now for the first time the true cost behind it. One more thing, Emily said, and her voice steadied into something firm and certain. Master Sergeant Halloran trained me 6 years ago in this exact building. He was one of the best analysts I ever learned from, and he is also the reason that ambush very nearly succeeded, because he chose silence when speaking up would have cost him something he wasn't willing to give. I tell you that not to shame a man who is already paying the full price for what he did, but because I want every single one of you to understand that the choice between integrity and self-preservation is not theoretical. It is not something that only happens in stories like this one. It happens in small moments, quiet moments, moments where nobody is watching and the stakes don't feel as dramatic as a mountain ambush. Build a habit of choosing integrity in those small moments, because when the large moment eventually comes for you, and it will come for some of you, you will not have time to build that character from scratch under pressure. You will only have whatever character you've already built. She stepped back from the podium to a silence that felt different from the silence in that briefing room 6 months earlier. Not the silence of dismissal, but the silence of people genuinely absorbing something that mattered. And then, slowly, the room rose to its feet, 40 young analysts standing in quiet, spontaneous respect for a sergeant who had refused to stay silent when silence would have been so much easier. Afterward, Whitfield found her in the hallway, and for a moment, neither of them said anything at all. "That was better than anything I could have said myself," he told her finally. "You gave me the room to say it, sir. That matters more than you probably realize." "I think I'm starting to understand exactly how much it matters, Sergeant. It's taken me most of a career to learn what you taught this post in 3 days almost." He extended his hand, and Emily shook it, the formal gesture carrying weight that went far beyond protocol. "Fort Redstone is a better command because you refused to let me be wrong 3 times in a row without a fight. I don't say that lightly, and I don't think I'll ever stop being grateful for it." Emily walked out of that building into the late afternoon light, her metal catching the sun briefly as she moved, and she thought, not for the first time, about the version of herself who had sat alone at 3 in the morning 6 months earlier, staring at a transcript nobody else believed mattered, wondering if she had the courage to knock on a major's door and risk everything to say something true. She thought about the convoy, 186 soldiers who had gone home to their families because a signal sergeant refused to let a pattern go unexamined. She thought about Owens and his fire team, about Doc's arm healing clean, about Reynolds standing beside her in every impossible moment when standing beside her cost him something too. She thought about Halloran and the strange, sorrowful complexity of a man who had once taught her everything she knew and then nearly destroyed everything he'd built because he chose silence over truth. And she thought about the young soldiers in that room, 40 faces who would carry into their own careers the same lesson she had learned the hardest possible way, that being right is never enough on its own, that courage requires more than conviction. It requires the willingness to keep speaking even after the room has laughed, even after the report has been torn in half and thrown away, even after every voice with more authority than yours has told you that you are wrong. Sergeant Emily Carter had walked into that first briefing room, a 28-year-old analyst nobody thought to take seriously, and she had walked out of Fort Redstone's history as the reason nobody there would ever again mistake silence for wisdom or rank for truth. She had been mocked, dismissed, threatened, and doubted at every turn, and she had saved 186 soldiers anyway, not because the system finally worked, but because she refused to let it fail without a fight. That is the story Fort Redstone tells its newest soldiers to this day, and it is a true one, every word of it, because some patterns are worth fighting for, and some warnings are too important to ever stay silent about, no matter who refuses to listen. Continuing directly from where Part 5 ended, before the story closes. 3 weeks after the ceremony, a letter arrived at Fort Redstone addressed simply to Sergeant E. Carter, the one who saw it coming. No return address, no unit designation, just Emily's name scrawled across the front in handwriting that looked like it had been written by someone unused to writing letters at all. She opened it at her desk, Ruiz glancing over curiously from his own terminal. "Who's writing you fan mail now, Carter?" "I don't know yet." She unfolded the single page inside. The letter was from a woman named Patricia Voss, mother of Corporal Michael Voss, who had been riding in the 11th vehicle of Convoy Silver Horizon on the morning it crossed through the exposed corridor at Raven Ridge Pass. Patricia wrote that her son had called her the week after the ambush, still shaken, describing how the convoy had been ordered to hold, then to move fast, How the radio chatter had gone electric with tension, none of them fully understood until later, when word filtered down through the ranks about what had actually been waiting on that ridge. Emily read the next lines twice before she trusted herself to say anything out loud. "My son is alive because someone refused to stop asking questions," the letter said. "I don't know your face, and I probably never will, but I think about you every single night when I say goodnight to my boy on the phone. Thank you isn't a big enough word for what you did, but it's the only one I have, so thank you, thank you, thank you." Emily set the letter down carefully, her hands unsteady in a way that had nothing to do with exhaustion this time. "Carter?" Ruiz's voice had gone soft, noticing her expression. "You okay?" "Yeah." She wiped at her eyes, not bothering to hide it this time. "Yeah, Danny, I'm okay. Better than okay, actually." She kept that letter folded inside her shroud from that day forward, and over the following months more arrived. Not many, but enough. Families of soldiers who had been on that convoy, some formal and brief, others long and rambling with gratitude that spilled well past the edges of what any single page could properly hold. Emily answered everyone personally, by hand, refusing Ruiz's suggestion that she simply have a form response typed up to save time. "They wrote something real to you," she told him. "The least I owe them is something real back." It was nearly 7 months after the ambush when the new escalation protocol Whitfield had championed faced its first real test, and Emily happened to be the one sitting at the analysis desk when it did. A young specialist named Priya Anand, barely 4 months into her posting, flagged an unusual communication pattern near a resupply route on the western perimeter, timing anomalies that reminded Emily uncomfortably of her own discovery all those months earlier. Anand brought it to Emily first, hesitant, clearly bracing for the same dismissal Emily herself had once faced. "I know it might be nothing," Anand said quickly, almost apologetically, sliding her printouts across the desk. "I know I'm new. I know this could just be noise, but the intervals keep repeating, and I can't make myself stop looking at it." Emily studied the data carefully, feeling an old, familiar chill settle into her spine as she recognized the shape of something real, hiding inside of numbers that could easily be waved away by someone who didn't want to look closely enough. "You did the right thing bringing this to me," Emily said. "Now let's do this properly, together." Under the new protocol, Anand's assessment, once cross-referenced against a follow-up satellite tasking that Emily herself helped push through channels in under 6 hours instead of 6 days, triggered an automatic secondary review at brigade level. No colonel required to personally believe it first. No report torn in half and thrown in a trash can. No 28-year-old sergeant forced to climb a ridge alone in the dark to be taken seriously. The pattern turned out to be a genuine, if smaller, insurgent staging effort, caught and neutralized nearly 2 weeks before it could mature into anything resembling what had nearly happened to Convoy Silver Horizon. No firefight, no convoy holding exposed on an open road while a young sergeant crouched among rocks calculating angles of fire. Just quiet, procedural competence, the system finally working the way it was always supposed to. Whitfield called Emily into his office that same evening, and this time there was no exhaustion in his face, no crisis pressing down on the room, only something that looked, unmistakably, like pride. "You saw the report from the western perimeter." "I helped write part of it, sir." "You did more than help write it, Carter. You mentored the analyst who found it. You pushed the tasking through in record time, and the entire operation moved through proper channels without a single soldier having to risk their life to be believed." He shook his head slowly, something like wonder in his voice. "Do you understand what you built here? Not just a medal, not just a good story people tell at dinner. You built a system that works now, one that didn't exist before you forced it into existence." Emily felt something settle deep inside her chest, a kind of quiet satisfaction that felt entirely different from the desperate, adrenaline-soaked victory of the ambush itself. "It's not just me, sir. It's Anand, trusting her own instincts enough to bring it forward instead of sitting on it the way I almost did that first night. It's the protocol doing exactly what it was designed to do." "It's both," Whitfield said firmly. "Don't diminish your own part in this, Sergeant. Humility is a virtue right up until it starts erasing the truth." That autumn, nearly a year after the ambush, Emily was offered a promotion to staff sergeant along with a transfer opportunity to a training command position, developing curriculum for signals intelligence analysts across 3 different posts, built explicitly around the lessons of Raven Ridge Pass. She sat with the offer for several days before accepting, turning over in her mind everything it would mean to leave the desk where she had first spotted the pattern nobody else believed. Ruiz found her packing up her final box of personal items on her last day at Fort Redstone's intelligence annex, the same small, cluttered desk where she had spent 3 sleepless weeks 3 years running, or so it felt, though it had truthfully only been a handful of months since that first terrible night. "Feels strange, doesn't it?" Gioni said, leaning in the doorway, "leaving this desk. Feels like leaving a piece of myself behind, honestly." Emily taped the final box shut, running her hand once over the worn surface of the desk where she'd built a case out of nothing but stubbornness and careful attention. "This is where I learned that being right isn't the same as being heard, and where I finally figured out the difference matters more than almost anything else in this job. You taught the rest of us that too, whether you meant to or not." Ruiz helped her lift the box. "Anand still tells that story to every new analyst who comes through this office. She calls it the Carter Standard. Trust the pattern, build the case, and never, ever let silence be the easier choice." Emily laughed softly, surprised and touched in equal measure. "The Carter Standard, that's a little dramatic." "Maybe. Doesn't make it wrong." Ruiz carried the box toward the door, then paused, looking back at her with something warmer than simple friendship. The particular bond forged between two people who had once stood together in the dark at 3 in the morning and chosen together to knock on a major's door instead of waiting until sunrise. "For what it's worth, Carter, I'm proud to have been the guy who told you to go straight to Reynolds that first night instead of waiting. You saved those soldiers too, Danny. Don't ever let yourself forget that part." Her final morning at Fort Redstone before she departed for her new posting, Emily walked once more to the edge of the training field where the ceremony had taken place months earlier, the early light stretching long and gold across the ground, and she thought, standing there, about her father's voice from years earlier, telling her that the hardest part of the job was never the enemy. It was making the people in her own chain listen when it mattered most. She understood now, in a way she hadn't fully grasped as a young sergeant staring at transcripts at 3 in the morning. That listening was never guaranteed. That authority did not automatically confer wisdom, and that the truth, no matter how carefully documented, no matter how thoroughly proven, still required someone brave enough to keep saying it even after the room had laughed, even after the report lay torn in a trash can, even after every voice with more rank than hers had told her, in no uncertain terms, to stop. She had not stopped. And because she had not stopped, 186 soldiers had gone home to their families. A compromised network inside her own command had finally been exposed and dismantled, and an entire system built to dismiss the very sergeants most likely to catch the next threat had been forced, painfully and necessarily, to change. Sergeant Emily Carter left Fort Redstone that morning, not as the frightened young analyst who had once been laughed out of a briefing room, but as the woman an entire command now measured its own courage against. The standard by which every future warning, every future pattern, every future sergeant with nothing but data and conviction would be judged. She had been mocked. She had been dismissed. She had been threatened with formal charges for refusing to stay silent. And in the end, none of that had mattered nearly as much as the simple, unbreakable fact that when it counted most, she had trusted what she knew to be true, and she had acted on it anyway. That is the legacy she left behind, carved not into a medal or a citation, but into the very structure of the system itself. And it will outlast every officer who ever doubted her, every soldier who ever underestimated her, and every voice that ever told her, wrongly, to stop looking closer.